The morning Vera Calloway's woodpile started drawing commentary. It was a Tuesday in late October of 2003, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter by 7 o'clock, low and flat, and pressing down on the ridgeline like a thumb on a bruise. I remember it because I had come up her lane to return a hydraulic fitting I had borrowed from her late husband Dale 6 months prior. A small brass elbow that had been sitting on my workbench long enough to collect a rim of dust, and when I pulled around the bend in the lane, I saw her up on the bed of the old flatbed, a green Dodge that Dale had bought in 1987 and that had not been licensed since his funeral in May of 2001, and she was rolling rounds off the side of the truck with her boot heel, letting them fall into the frost-stiff grass at the edge of the drive. The rounds were big, red oak mostly, cut from trees that had come down on the back 40 when the derecho went through the summer before. Rounds 2 feet across and 16 inches of length, some of them, and she was moving them one by one with her foot and then climbing down to set them on the splitter block herself. She was 63 years old that October. She had a bad left knee. I stood there a moment before I said anything, which I am not proud of, and I will own that hesitation because there is no good reason for it except that a man of 54 sometimes does not trust himself to offer help, without it coming out as something else, as pity or as condescension, and Vera Calloway was not a woman who received either one gracefully. She had grown up on this same hollow, married into it, and buried 2 parents and a husband in it, and she had the kind of quiet authority that the ground itself sometimes has in certain seasons where it does not need to announce what it is because you can read it well enough from standing on it. I got out of the truck. I handed her the fitting, and she looked at it a moment and put it in her coat pocket and said she had wondered where that went. I asked her if she wanted a hand with the wood. She said she would not turn one down. We split and stacked for 2 hours that morning, not talking much, the way good farm work tends to go, and I drove home thinking nothing of it except that I should have come sooner. By noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. The story at the diner, as I heard it reported back to me by my wife that evening, was that Vera Calloway had 6 cords of unsplit oak standing in her drive, and had been trying to move it with a garden cart and a prayer, and that I had been over there since before sunup. Neither part was precisely accurate, but that is how a small town keeps its books, and I have learned not to correct the ledger when the spirit of the entry is close enough. What is true is that she had approximately 4½ cords of oak cut and stacked in the round, and nowhere near enough of it split for what was coming. What is also true is that more than a few people in that hollow heard the same version of the story I did, and not one of them drove up her lane with a maul or a splitter in the weeks that followed. I drove up twice more that fall. A man named Garrett, who lived on the far side of the ridge, came once and split for an afternoon and did not come back. The rest of the hollow went about its business. It is not my place to judge that, or not entirely my place, and I say it only to locate where we were by the first week of December, which is to say that Vera had roughly 2 cords of good split oak under the shed roof, and the rest was still in the round, covered with a blue poly tarp that the wind was working at steadily from the south corner. The Farmer's Almanac that year had called for a hard winter in our zone, and I had not given that much weight, because the almanac calls for a hard winter the way a rooster calls for the sun, reliably and without any particular claim to causation. The old barometer my father had hung in the mudroom was doing something I paid more attention to, dropping slow and steady through late November in the way it does before a real event, not the nervous jump and fall of a passing front, but the long, patient decline of something that has made up its mind. I want to be honest about my reasons for going back up her lane in early December, because they were not entirely selfless ones. I had grown up hearing my grandfather talk about the Calloway timber ground in a particular way, in the way old men sometimes talk about another man's land when they believe it was put together correctly, when they believe the person who assembled it knew what they were doing across a longer span than most people bother to think across. My grandfather had known Vera's father-in-law, a man named Cleet Calloway, who had farmed this same ground from the mid-1920s through the late 1960s, and who had, according to my grandfather, been one of the more patient and attentive men he had ever seen work a piece of land. My grandfather used to say that Cleet Calloway had covered it proper, which was a phrase that could mean several things depending on what ground you were talking about and what season you were standing in, but which always meant, at its root, that the man had thought ahead of the weather by more than one season at a time. I had no particular business on the Calloway place. Vera did not owe me anything, and I did not owe her anything beyond the ordinary weight of being a neighbor, which, in a hollow this size, carries a certain specific gravity that does not require a formal accounting. But I had been thinking about what my grandfather said. I had been thinking about it more as winter came on and the barometer kept going where it was going, and I suppose I was looking for a reason to be on that ground and to look at it more carefully. The split wood was a good reason. It was a real thing that needed doing. I did not let myself examine the other part too closely. My wife asked me the morning I left how many cords I thought I would get through before dark. I told her I was going to split wood for the widow. She said that was not what she had asked. She was right. She is usually right about which question I am not answering. There is a particular smell to a hardwood splitter running in cold weather, the hydraulic fluid and the split grain and the iron of the wedge all coming together in the dry air, and it is one of those smells that for me has always been associated with a feeling of rightness, of doing the thing the land requires in the season it requires it, which is its own kind of satisfaction that does not depend on anyone's approval. I had the splitter from my neighbor Darrell for the weekend, a husky 22-ton that was old enough to have opinions of its own about cold mornings, and I had it running by 7:45 on a Saturday when the temperature was 11 degrees and the light was coming in flat and white from the east. Vera came out with coffee at 8 and set it on the fender of the Dodge without a word and went back inside. That was the entirety of the ceremony. I split for 3 hours and got through the bulk of what was still in the round. Not all of it, but enough that I could see what was left and estimate it. And what was left was manageable. Perhaps a cord and a half in the round, and maybe 3 cords of good dry split wood under cover now, and that was enough to see a woman through most of what a normal winter in this zone would put against her, barring something outside the usual range. The barometer at my house when I got home that evening was doing something I had not seen it do in 5 years. My grandfather's phrase was back in my mouth before I had even taken off my boots. He had covered it proper. The question was whether Vera had enough cover for what was actually coming, not for a normal winter, but for the kind of event the barometer was beginning to describe. And the answer, by my rough calculation, was that she was close but not certain. And close but not certain is the same as not certain when you are 63 years old with a bad knee and you live a quarter mile off the county road at the end of a lane that a loaded gravel truck would not willingly attempt in good conditions. I am going to tell you now about the notebook because the notebook is the center of this, and I have been arriving at it for a while in the way that I tend to arrive at the things that matter, which is by taking the long way around and hoping you're still with me. You learn which fights the land will let you win, my grandfather used to say, and the corollary to that, which he never stated directly, but which I came to understand over a long time, is that you also learn which ones were never yours to fight in the first place, and that understanding the difference is more than half the work of farming and more than half the work of being a neighbor. Vera Calloway found the notebook in the spring of 2002, the first spring she was alone on the place, going through the cedar chest in the back bedroom where Dale had kept things that were not quite important enough for the filing cabinet and not quite unimportant enough to throw away. She told me about it the second afternoon I came to split wood in November of 2003, offhand, the way people sometimes tell you the important things, tucked between 2 sentences about something ordinary. She said she had found her father-in-law's old notebook, the one he had used to keep his observations on the timber ground and the drainage, and that some of it she could read and some of it she couldn't, because Cleet Calloway had the penmanship of a man who wrote for himself and not for anyone else, cramped and hurrying and occasionally switching mid-entry from pencil to a pen that was running dry. She said there was one part she had read several times and still was not sure she understood, and that she had meant to ask someone about it, but had not gotten around to it. I told her I would be glad to look at it if she ever wanted. She nodded and went back to stacking. I put it out of my mind for 3 weeks, the way I tend to put things out of my mind when they are not yet fully ripe, which is a habit my wife calls postponing, and which I prefer to think of as giving a thing time to want to be looked at. She brought it out the Saturday I came with the splitter. While I was drinking the coffee she had put on the fender, she came back out with a marbled composition book, the black and white kind, its corners gone soft with age, the cover buckled, where it had gotten damp at some point, and dried out again. She handed it to me without a word, and went back to the house. I held it a moment before I opened it, the way you hold a thing you know is going to matter before you let it start mattering. The penmanship was exactly what she had described, small and sideways and pressed hard into the paper, and many of the entries were terse to the point of being codes, single words and numbers that meant something to Cleet Calloway in the moment of writing and had been carrying that meaning in the dark ever since. Timber Cruise, 1951, Block 4, 14 Oak 8, Hickory 3 Ash, fair to good. Tile outlet, Northfield needs rotting, spring 1958. Planted east woodlot border, Osage orange, 22 trees, 1947, alive. These were the ordinary entries of a man who paid close attention and trusted that the record would be worth keeping. It was near the back of the first third of the book that I found the entry she had meant. It was dated March of 1963, which would have put Cleet Calloway at somewhere around 58 years old, a man in the late middle of his life and his farming, past the urgency of youth and not yet into the contraction of old age, still moving through the ground with the long striding attention of a man who believes he has enough time to understand what he is looking at. The entry read, "Followed spring seep from upper woodlot to where it goes under the lane, did not lose it. Found standing again north of the old springhouse site, 15 rod north. Covered it proper, 1931. Then, below that line, indented and circled in pencil, 3 words and a question mark, in slightly larger letters than everything around them, still good below." I looked at those words for a long time in the thin morning light, the splitter idling behind me and the steam coming off my coffee, and I felt the particular sensation that comes when an old question introduces itself to you before you knew you were ready to ask it. She had a well house. I knew that. Every old farmstead in this hollow has one, some of them still in use, and some of them collapsed to their foundation stones and grown over, but the well houses on the Calloway ground had always been part of the story my grandfather told about Cleet building the place with a longer view than most men bother with. What I did not know, and what I was now thinking about with considerable attention, was whether the spring Cleet had followed in March of 1963 was the same one that fed the lower pasture, and had given the Calloways their supplementary water in the dry summers of the 1950s, or whether it was something else, something that had been covered properly in 1931 and had been sitting there undisturbed beneath the frost line ever since, doing exactly what a properly covered spring does, which is hold its temperature and hold its flow and wait for whoever comes after with enough patience and enough curiosity to ask it the right question. I put the notebook in my coat pocket, and I did not tell Vera where it was going. I want to be honest about that. I told her I wanted to look at it more carefully at home, in better light, and she said that was fine. That part was true. The better light was also a way of saying I was not ready yet to say out loud what I was thinking, because there is a particular kind of carefulness that attaches to other people's ground, especially a widow's ground, especially when you are a man who is used to moving through the world with more confidence than the evidence sometimes warrants. You do not walk a woman's farm and tell her what you think is under it until you are prepared to be wrong about it in front of her, and I was not yet prepared for that. I took the notebook home. I sat with it that evening under the lamp in the kitchen, my wife reading at the other end of the table, and I read the entry again, and I read the entries around it, and I looked at what Cleet had written about water on that farm going back to the 1940s. He had been, in his terse and private way, a serious student of where the water went on that ground. There were notes about wet spots in certain corners of certain fields after certain kinds of rain. There were notes about where the tile lines ran, or where he believed they ran, drawn in pencil in the back pages of the book with measurements that were rough but consistent. There was a note from the spring of 1949 about the northeast corner of the upper woodlot staying wet 2 weeks after everything else had drained, and a note from the same location in 1955 that said same corner, same wet, earlier this year, meaning the wet had come sooner in 1955 than in 1949. A man watching the same corner of the same woods over 6 years and writing down what he saw. Not because anyone asked him to, because the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention, and Cleet Calloway had been paying attention since before the Second World War. My wife looked up from her book at some point and asked me what I was reading. I told her I was reading Cleet Calloway's farm notebook. She asked me why. I told her I was trying to find out where the water goes on the Calloway place. She looked at me for a moment with the particular expression she reserves for things that she understands better than she lets on, and then she said, "How much ground are we talking about?" I told her I did not know yet. She went back to her book. That was the end of that conversation, and it was enough. I want to tell you what happened in the second week of December of 2003, because that is where this story turns, and everything that came before it is the long approach to this turn, and I have been taking you on that approach on purpose because you cannot understand the turn without it. On the night of December the 9th, which was a Tuesday, the ice storm that the barometer had been promising since late November finally arrived. It came in from the southwest after midnight, the rain turning to freezing rain somewhere around 2 in the morning, and by the time the sky began to go gray, it had put 3/4 of an inch of clear ice on everything that was not moving, and several things that had been. 3/4 of an inch does not sound like a number that means much until you understand what it means to a county road and a lane and a power line, and what it means to a woman alone on 40 acres with a bad knee and a wood stove and a 1/4 mile of lane between her and anyone who might think to check. The county road went impassable before 5 in the morning. The power went out for a large portion of the hollow before 6. By 7, I had already put on every layer I owned and walked to the top of my lane to look at the county road, and I had already turned around and come back, because the county road was a mirror, and the ditches on both sides of it were invisible beneath the ice, and my truck was a half-ton with all-season tires and no real ambition for the conditions we were in. What I am about to tell you is not something I am proud of, and I want to say that plainly before I say the rest of it. Vera Calloway was a 1/4 mile further up the hollow from me, and there was a 1/4 mile of county road between my lane and hers, and I could not get there. I tried twice on foot before 8 in the morning, and the second time I went down in the ditch and came up with my right elbow and my dignity equally damaged, and I stood at the edge of her lane looking at the ruts of it through the ice and understanding that the lane was manageable on foot if you went carefully, if you were younger than I was, if you had not just fallen in a ditch. I am 74 years old now, and I was 54 then, and the arithmetic of ice and distance is different at 54 than it was at 30, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I went back to my house, and I got on the telephone, and I called Vera's number, and the line was dead, which I had expected, and I stood in my kitchen for a while with the receiver in my hand and the ice ticking against the south window, and the barometer on the wall doing nothing I needed to read, because it had already told me everything it had to say. What happened next is the part of this story that I did not expect, and I have thought about it many times in the 20 years since, and I have never entirely resolved how to feel about it, which may mean that it is the most honest part. By 9 o'clock on the morning of December the 9th, 4 vehicles had attempted the county road between my lane and Vera Calloway's lane. None of them made it. One of them put a front wheel in the ditch and had to be pulled out the following afternoon. By 10 o'clock, the Garrett boy from the far side of the ridge had gotten as far as the mouth of her lane on foot, wearing ice cleats, and had knocked on her door and found her in good order, warm, with the wood stove drawing and a pot on and 2 cords of split oak under the shed roof. He came back and reported this fact to the small collection of neighbors who had gathered at the foot of her lane with various degrees of helpfulness and guilt, and there was a general release of breath along the lane, the way there always is when the outcome is better than the worry. I was among those people. I had finally made it down the county road by staying on the grass of the shoulder, moving about a quarter mile an hour, and I had joined the small congregation at the mouth of her lane, and I had listened to the Garrett boy report that she was fine and that she had coffee on if anyone wanted to come up. Several people went up. I did not, because my elbow was swelling inside my coat, and because I was thinking about the notebook in my kitchen, and about the circled question at the bottom of the March 1963 entry, and about the 2-inch soil probe in my barn that I had not used in 3 seasons. The ice began to melt on December the 11th. By December the 14th, the county road was clear enough for gravel trucks, and on December the 16th, a Tuesday, I drove up Vera Calloway's lane with a soil probe, a 50-foot tape, and a topographic map of the hollow that I had gotten from the county extension office some years before, and which had been living in the flat drawer of my filing cabinet, doing nothing in particular. I had also, in the days between the ice storm and that morning, done something I do not do naturally or easily, which is ask for help from someone who knows more than I do. I had called a man named Harold Swick, who had been the county drainage engineer for 22 years before his retirement in 1998, and who was, by general agreement, the person in our county who most thoroughly understood where the water went underground in our particular geology. Harold Swick was a large, unhurried man who wore the same Carhartt jacket in every season, and who had the habit of going very quiet when he was thinking, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that you do not want to fill with unnecessary sound. I had talked to Harold about 3 times in my life before this, and each conversation had been brief and useful, which is the ideal ratio for a man who knows what he knows. I told Harold what Cleet Calloway had written in the notebook. I read him the entry over the phone, word for word, the one about following the spring seep from the upper woodlot and finding it again north of the old springhouse site, and the one about covering it properly in 1931, and the circle question at the bottom. Harold was quiet for what I estimated at 20 seconds, which, in a telephone conversation with a man who does not waste words, is approximately the same as a paragraph. Then he said, "Read me that distance again." I told him 15 rod. He said that was roughly 247 feet. I told him that was my calculation also. He said, "What's the fall on that ground north to south?" I told him I had not measured it yet, but that from the topographic map it appeared to be somewhere between 8 and 12 feet over the distance, which put the grade at somewhere between 3.5% and 5%. He was quiet again. Then he said, "That's a natural collection point for a tile-drained spring." He said, "If a man covered it properly in 1931, he would have put vitrified clay tile over it at 30 inches minimum, probably 36. And if the tile is intact, it is likely still moving water right now." I asked him if he would come and look at it with me. He said he would come on Thursday. Harold Swick arrived on Thursday the 18th of December at 7 in the morning, which is the hour at which a man who spent 22 years doing field work arrives at things regardless of retirement. He drove a truck that was clean, but not too clean, which I have always taken as a sign of good character in a man who works with land. He had a tile probe of his own, longer than mine, and a small level, and he walked the ground from the lane to the north edge of the old springhouse foundation, with his eyes down and his hands in his pockets for the first 10 minutes without saying anything, and I followed him and also said nothing, because there is a protocol to watching a man read ground that he is serious about, and the protocol is to stay out of the way. He stopped twice and stood still with his eyes moving across the contour of the land, and the second time he stopped, he took out the level and held it against the slope and read it without announcing what he found. Then he walked to a point approximately 40 feet north of where the springhouse foundation ended, a point that was in the middle of what had been, since at least the 1980s, a stand of volunteer Osage orange and multiflora rose that had filled in over an old low place in the ground, and he stopped there and said, "Probe here." I probed there. At 31 inches I hit something hard and hollow-sounding, the particular resistance and resonance of a clay tile that has been in the ground for 7 decades and is still whole. The probe did not break through. It stopped and held, the way a probe stops when it is resting on something that means to stay. Harold Swick watched me pull the probe out and look at the end of it, which was clean and undisturbed, and he said nothing for what I now believe was closer to 30 seconds. Then he said one word, which was intact. He said it the way a man says the word when he means it as a conclusion and not as a question. And then he took out his own probe and drove it into the ground 18 inches west of my hole, and at 33 inches he found the same thing. And he pulled his probe and looked at it and said, "You've got a functioning spring tile here, possibly 80 feet of it, possibly more, depending on where Callaway ran the line." He said, "If it's draining the way I think it's draining, there's a reliable water source on this property that's been working underground since 1931 and has never been mapped on any document I've seen." I asked him what it was worth. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "That depends on what she needs it for," and looked at me, and I understood that he was not being evasive, but precise, which is the kind of answer you get from a man who has spent 22 years being careful with other people's ground. The short answer to his question, which I did not have yet, but which I would have by the following spring, is that what Vera Callaway needed it for was a reliable secondary water source for the 15 acres of bottom ground on the north end of the farm, ground that had been increasingly unreliable in dry summers because the main well was old and the pump was older, and which she had been compensating for by hauling water in a 300-gallon poly tank on the back of the unlicensed Dodge, which is the kind of solution that works until it stops working, and which had been costing her more in fuel and time and wear on a body with a bad knee than she had ever said out loud to anyone. The spring tile that Cleet Callaway had covered properly in 1931 by Harold Swick's estimate, after 2 more visits and a careful probe of the full run of the line, was discharging somewhere between 4 and 6 gallons per minute at the outlet point, consistent through the dry season, which is what a limestone-fed spring in our geology tends to do when it has been managed correctly and left alone long enough to establish its own equilibrium. 4 to 6 gallons per minute is not a number that sounds dramatic until you multiply it by the hours in a day and the days in a summer drought, and then it becomes the difference between a bottom pasture that holds and one that doesn't, and the difference between a widow who can run her place and one who can't. I want to tell you about the morning I told Vera what we had found, because that morning is the part of this that stays with me most clearly, more than the probe-finding tile and more than Harold Swick's one-word confirmation and more than the neighbor's eventual acknowledgement, which came later and which I will get to. I drove up her lane on a morning in late December, 4 days before Christmas of 2003, and she was splitting the last of the cord and a half of unsplit oak with a maul, working through it the way she had always worked through hard things, steadily and without commentary. I stood at a reasonable distance and waited until she set the maul down on its own, and then I told her what we had found. I told her about the tile, and about Harold's estimate of the flow, and about what her father-in-law had written in the notebook in March of 1963, the entry about following the spring and the circled question at the bottom. I had the notebook with me, and I showed her the entry. She read it without expression, and then she read it again, and then she handed the notebook back to me and picked up the maul and set a round on the block and split it, and did not say anything for what I estimated at a full minute. Then she said, "He always said, the north end of that pasture was better than it looked." I said that he had been right. She said, "I expect he usually was." Then she picked up another round and set it on the block, and that was the end of the formal acknowledgment. The Garrett boy, who had come to her door on the morning of the ice storm with ice cleats and a sufficient amount of determination to cross a quarter-mile of glazed county road on foot, came back in January and helped me run a shallow trench from the tile outlet to a collection box I put together from 2 sections of precast concrete and a length of 4-inch perforated pipe. It was not an engineering marvel. Harold Swick came out and looked at it and said it would do. The 4 words he used to say that it would do were, "That'll move the water," which from Harold was the equivalent of an enthusiastic endorsement. By April of 2004, the box was filling reliably, and the overflow was running into the low place at the north end of the pasture that Clete Calloway had noted in his spring observations, the wet corner that stayed wet 2 weeks after everything else had drained, and which was wet in that year for the first time in at least a decade, because the tile was now draining freely rather than backing up against the accumulated silt at the old outlet point, which Harold said was what had been gradually reducing the flow over the previous 30 years. A slow accumulation of silt and debris at an outlet that no one knew to check, because no one knew the outlet was there. The tile itself was intact. Vitrified clay, 30-inch depth, 83 feet of run from the collection point under the Osage Orange to the outlet at the edge of the pasture. Intact and flowing, never dug up, never replaced. Set in 1931 by a man who had covered it proper and written down the question his grandson's wife would need, answered 72 years later. I drove past the Calloway place in the spring and the summer of 2004 more times than I needed to, which I will admit, and each time I looked at the north pasture, I felt something that is hard to name precisely, but which I have come to think of as the satisfaction of a long loop circuit finally closing. The neighbor who had said the least and helped the least in the autumn of 2003, a man named Curtis, who ran a 100-acre corn operation south of the hollow and who drove a truck that was cleaner than anything that regularly visited a farm, had a right to be. Drove past the Calloway place in June of 2004 and stopped at my lane on his way back south and said, "That north end of Vera's pasture is greener than I have ever seen it." I told him there was a spring tile under it that had been put in 1931. He looked at me and then looked back in the direction of the Calloway place and then said, "I wondered why she never ran cattle up there." I told him she might now. He nodded twice slowly, the way a man nods when he is revising something he had taken for granted, and then he drove on. That was the entirety of the conversation, and it was enough. You do not need more than that from a man whose truck is cleaner than it ought to be. What I have come to believe, in the 20 years since that ice storm and that soil probe and that marbled composition book with its corners gone soft, is that Clete Calloway's gift to whoever came after him was not the tile itself, though the tile was the gift in its physical form. The gift was the notebook, and the gift inside the notebook was the question, the circled 3 words with the question mark, that he had put there in March of 1963, because he had done a thing in 1931, and he was not certain enough of his own memory, or certain enough of how long the thing would last that he was willing to let it go unrecorded. He covered it proper, and then he wrote down the question of whether it was still good below, because he understood that someone else would have to answer that question after he was gone, and that the person who answered it would need to know where to look. That is the long view. That is what my grandfather meant when he said Cleet had covered it proper. He did not mean only the tile, he meant the record. He meant the act of leaving a question in a notebook for someone who would not be born until after he had written it down. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention, and Cleet Calloway had been attending to that ground since before the Second World War, and the attention did not stop when he stopped. It went into the notebook. The notebook went into the cedar chest. The cedar chest waited for a woman with a bad knee and an unlicensed Dodge, and 4.5 cords of unsplit oak, and a neighbor slow enough to ask the right question. I have told this story at my kitchen table, and I have told it leaning on a fence, and I have told it standing in the hardware store waiting for a part to be looked up, and every time I tell it, someone tells me a version of their own. A grandmother's hand-drawn map of a fence line that turned out to hold an easement no one had known to look for. A grandfather's notation about a wet corner of a field that turned out to be the softest piece of ground in the county once the tile was rotted. An old well log in a metal box in a smokehouse that told a family exactly where their water had come from for 80 years and where to look when the pump went quiet. These are the gifts the patient ones left behind, and we do not always know to look for them until the ice storm comes, and the barometer has already told us what it knew, and the question in the notebook has been waiting in the dark of the cedar chest for as long as it needed to wait. The field does not care who believes in it. That is what I have learned. It will keep its water and its tile and its spring and its long-accumulated answer to the long-accumulated question, regardless of whether any living person knows to ask it. The only variable is whether someone shows up with a probe and a notebook and enough patience to be wrong before they are right, and enough humility to follow an old man's pencil marks across a frost-stiff pasture to a stand of Osage orange, where the ground drops slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the way that ground drops when something below it has been moving water for 70 years. I am glad I showed up. I am glad I went the long way around. I am glad I borrowed the notebook and sat with it under the lamp until it began to make the kind of sense that takes time to make. The tile is still there. The spring is still moving. The north pasture is green in years when everything else goes brown. Vera Calloway sold the place in 2011 to a young couple from 2 counties over who did not know what they had, and I drove up her lane the morning before closing, and I asked her if she had told them about the tile. She said she had written it down in a notebook and left it in the cedar chest. I told her that was the right way to do it. She said she expected it was. Then she went inside, and I drove down the lane, and that was the last time I was on the Calloway ground, and I was glad it ended there, with the question passed forward in the proper form, in the proper place, in the dark of the cedar chest where it would wait for whoever needed it. If you have got a piece of ground with an old question in it, or a notebook in a cedar chest you have been meaning to read, or a neighbor who has been hauling water in a poly tank when there might be a spring tile 50 feet from where she parks the truck, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. And if this kind of story means something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there.